Hi, do you want to learn how to take patterns from your favorite clothes? My name is Annika. Welcome to my pattern making on the road series, where I want to show you how easy it is to take patterns of existing garments. In the process that I'm using and that I want to show you, I will lay the garment out on the patterning paper and trace around the outlines with pins. Therefore, I need a board underneath that I can push pins into. I'm using this cork pin board, but you can also use a styrofoam plate or something similar. It needs to be big enough to fit the area you want to trace. To recreate the pattern, we need a paper that is roughly the size of your garment. I found a roll of white paper in a local office store. You want to find yourself a quality that is neither too thick or too thin and fairly strong. I am cutting a piece of paper that fits the whole top. I am reverse engineering this pattern, and what's important to know is that patterns are usually only drafted around half the body. This is why I will address only one side of the top. First, I draw the center front and the center back onto the paper. That is the exact middle fold of my top. This is also the grain line. In pattern making, the grain line is the most fundamental element. The grain line is the vertical alignment of the grain of the fabric. I also square off the end of the line at the bottom. This is my hem line. Angles are important in pattern making, and the more correct you can work here, the better your pattern will come out later. Once I've drawn my center front and squared off my hemline, I can unfold my top and make sure it's folded out and lying perfectly flat. I also check that the side seams are not twisted to the front or the back. If your top is used a lot and washed many times, this might not be possible, and in this case, just make it lie flat. You can always use an iron with steam to help you get it back in shape. Now I need to determine the exact center by measuring the width at the hem and the width at the underarm. I am also measuring the length of the side seam. This is how I determine the height of the underarm circumference line. Using these measurements, I can now mark the outside point at the hemline, and I can measure up along my center front to mark the height of my underarm line. I square off that mark to both sides just like I squared off my hemline. I can now mark the outside of my underarm line, which is a half of the width of my total underarm circumference. This way, I roughly establish my pattern grid foundation. Now I know how to place my garment on the paper. I am aligning the lower left of my top with the outer measure of the hemline. Then I'm aligning the upper point of the left side seam with the outer measure of the underarm circumference line. I now know that the top is exactly centered on the center line. The upper neck part of my shirt still needs to be aligned at the center in the same way. Therefore, I find myself a reference point in the neckline and measure horizontally across. Again, I divide it by 2 and fix it in place at the center with a pin. Now I can start tracing my outlines, and wherever my side seam meets the trim at the seam, that is where I place my first pin. I'm also pinning the lower point to fix it. The fabric should be lying as flat as possible. I disregard anything past my center line because I'm only focusing on one half of the pattern. I have straightened out my lower part, and now I have to re-establish the upper part. In the neckline and armhole area, we have a little bit of a negative ease, and that is why the fabric contracts here. In jerseys, the neckband is stitched in under tension to offer integrity of the shape and to follow the curve best. I will explain that better when we cut the shirt later. For now, we have to find the relaxed state of the shirt. I pull it just enough so that the fabric relaxes where it was scrunched up, and I am carefully re-establishing the original shape of the armhole and the neckline. It is crucially important to work correctly regarding the alignment. Avoid a twisting or diagonal distortion of your top, as well as stretching it further than its natural relaxed state. I start working to trace the outline with my pin all around the shirt and inside the neck trim, as well as the trim around the armhole. You want to think tracing the seam lines. By this I mean tracing the seams where it is either stitched like the side seam or folded like the hem. I trace around the finished edge, or in the neck and armhole, I find the seam where the trim is connected to the top. I'm going along these lines in 1/2 inch increments and push my pins along the seams through the fabric and the paper to trace the outline of my future pattern. I am starting at the center front and trace the front neck, the side seam, and I also trace the back neckline. This is a bit tricky because some parts are hidden by the front of the top. Here I carefully feel where the trim is stitched in the back, and I'm just doing my best to find it for now. Now I can take my top aside and re-establish the lines connecting the pin pricks with a pencil. I'm using my ruler to make sure that the first few millimeters of my back neckline is squared to the center line. I do the same for the front neck in the center. With a 90-degree angle, I make sure that the transition to the other side will be smooth when I mirror the pattern later. I also know that my shoulder seam is perfectly straight. I draw it out first and trace my neck and armhole from there. Since the strap is turning at the shoulder, it gets a bit confusing. You can pull your shirt back out to see how it was made. From here, I'm just taking my time to draw the lines and slowly carve out the outline of the shirt. Once I have everything drawn out the way I feel happy with it, I can fold it up in the center. I want to copy one side onto the other side. I'm tracing the front outlines of the armhole and neck with a black marker, just to not confuse myself. Here I can also use my quilting ruler to already clean up a little bit. It's transparent and it has small increments, which helps me to check the overall width and even look. I draw the curves, and then I trace the front to the other side with this rotary tool that has sharp teeth. At this point, my hemline is established and I like to cut away the paper at the bottom. I also know that the side seam is the same for both front and back. This means I can also cut around all the outer lines to make the piece easier to handle. When I fold the two halves apart, I have now perfectly mirrored my front pattern onto the other side of my fold. I can now separate the two sides and cut out the front pattern panel. Before I cut out the back pattern, armhole and neckline, I need to check my transitions. This is a step that is necessary before going ahead. I put the two patterns together at the underarm seam and check the transition from the front to the back. I like to place a piece of tape which allows me to hold things in place while I draw the transition into the back armhole. The back armhole is a little bit lower and I use my ruler again to lead the line into the curve in the back. And I cross out the old front pattern lines to not confuse me. Before I trace all the way towards the shoulder, I cut the armhole at the transition just for the few inches of the armhole. Transitions are important in pattern making and I like to use my scissors to cut the transitions because I feel I can really fine-tune the curve best with my scissors. I cut the tape at the side seam to separate the two pieces. There's another important transition, and that is the transition at the shoulder. This is where the front gets stitched to the back and it's supposed to form a nice and straight continuation into the back. This is why I tape this area together again here at the shoulder seam to check the transition just in the same way I did under the arm. The more clear you mark your lines, the less confusing it gets. I like to use colored markers sometimes to not confuse the lines of the front and the back. Since I don't have any here, I hope this will not confuse you too much. Take your time to align everything right. I like to use a ruler to really make sure that I get that part right. Once I have that transition the way I like it, I can trace the rest of the back armhole. I use my scissors again to cut the transition at the shoulder. Then I cut the shoulder seam to separate the pieces again. And this is my pattern. Cleaning up the pattern. To clean up my pattern and to make it ready for cutting the fabric, I need to copy my draft onto a blank piece of paper again. I start by drawing my center seam, and this is always my first step. Working with jerseys, I like to have the pattern as a whole piece. This means I leave myself enough room on either side of the paper before starting to trace the outlines onto the paper. I carefully line up the center front of my pattern with the center line I just drew on the paper. Before I draw around the pattern to copy it, I pin it in a couple of spots so it doesn't move. Now I can trace around the outside, and when I'm done, I can take the pins out and move my first draft to the side. I now have the whole outline traced on one side of the center line. This pattern has no seam allowances yet. I noticed that the strap of this top is very thin. Since I want to change the trim to an easier to sew variation, I decided to add a little width in the strap area to make room for the seam allowances. Once you establish the shape of your top, this is generally what you can play with at this point. You can change the width of the straps or change the shape and depth of the neckline if you like. Designer's choice. In my case, I only add a little width to the strap, and I do that towards the outside to not change the distance to the neck. I am extending the shoulder outwards to make the strap 3/4 inch total. Since I only want to add width to the strap, I let the new line zero into the underarm curve and make it a smooth transition. I like to hand draw my curves, but there are curved rulers out there that can help you with drawing curves. I really like spending some time to adjust my curves until I like them. I also check the 90-degree angle in the center front neck and draw out my curve from there. Now I'm ready to add seam allowances. And if you look at my original trim here, you see that it is a band that was folded 3 times around the seam allowance. This is very difficult to stitch right without a special machine. And this is why I want to show you a nice clean way of stitching in a neckband, which looks great and is super easy. My band will just sit under the edge. Normally, I would stitch it in with my serger, but since I don't have one here, even more so, a smaller seam allowance helps me to keep the edges small and clean looking. I'm using my transparent quilting ruler to add 3/8 of an inch seam allowance to the edge. I do this on all outside edges, the neckline, the armhole, and the side seam. I do not address the hemline yet because I want to do this in a later step. Most t-shirts have a straight hem. I personally don't like the angle that it makes in the side seam, and I usually make the hem a little bit curved to have a straight transition at the side seam. To do that, I square off the hemline at the side seam so that it runs into the first third of the hemline. I personally just like this better, and you can obviously do whatever feels right for you. I also make it a little bit longer in the center because I do like the round hem and softer curves. Now I only need to add the seam allowance to the hem. At the bottom, the seam allowance is simply turned inside, and I measure my original hem to see how much I need to add here. I want to add 3/4 to my hem, and I start again by squaring the first few millimeters from the center line and then follow the curve at 3/4 of an inch. Now that I have all my seam allowance added, I can cut the pattern in the fold, and a great way to make sure that it doesn't shift and distort is to pin both sides together in a few spots. I like to put my pins in the corners. Paper likes to shift while cutting, and this way it's forced to stay perfectly aligned. This will be your final pattern and what you use to cut the fabric with. The more precise you can be here, the better. And here it is. This is my perfectly mirrored pattern of my front top. And it's ready to be used. I like to mark it. I like to mark the center front, which is in this case also the grain line. I like to give it a name and a date, and this way I can archive my pattern iterations and modifications chronologically. Now I will need to do the same thing with my back pattern. Since I modified the width of my strap in the front, I have to do the same thing in the back. I'm adding my width towards the outside and let my new line zero into the armhole in the back. I'm drawing the new line by hand, and again, that is because I like to do it this way. At this point, I also erase my old line to not confuse me. Now I need to check my shoulder seam transition, and in order to do so, I pretend that I'm stitching it together at the shoulder seam. In order to see the front pattern outlines before seam allowance, I need to retrace them to the back of the front piece. This way I can see how the transitions will look like once it's stitched together. I pin my piece to the board and can now trace the continuation lines into the back pattern. Just like I did it with the front, I add my seam allowances to my pattern, which is again 3/8 of an inch all around the necklines and the armhole, the shoulder seam and the side seam. After I have added the side seam allowance, I can match up my side seams and copy the hemline. I am now using the new outline to trace the seam allowance to the inside of that outline. In the front pattern piece, the seam allowance is 3/4 of an inch and I use the same for the back. At this point, I'm erasing all old lines and I fold it in the center again, cut it out just like I cut the front piece. Here's my front and the back pattern of my top. You might be wondering, it is still missing the neckband and the armhole trim. I will tell you how I cut myself a trim as I go in part 2. In the next parts of the series, I will show you how I made this top into another top and a dress, and I will also show you how I stitched it all together. I will also talk about how I work with jerseys and show you a neat way to assemble this top using only a simple sewing machine. I'll put all the important links and info in the description below. I really hope you go try it out for yourself. It's so much fun. If you found this video useful, make sure you like and subscribe to my channel. This is just the beginning of a series of pattern making videos, and this way you get notified when the new content drops.